Frequency doesn't have a reliable, consistent, independent effect on hypertrophy.
After a period of time, I have a feeling you would just hate that and your effort would be compromised.
Frequency absolutely matters so long as XYZ. I guess what I'm saying here is that frequency does seem to matter, at least in my experience, in my coaching practice, quite a bit, but it largely comes down to practical considerations and appears to be something that you just use strategically with the skill of training or the skill of coaching in this case to allow those primary variables to kind of settle into place. I'll put the powerlifting example aside because that's quite a different beast for a later podcast because the results of frequency and strength are quite a bit different. But ultimately, I'm, again, just to put my cards on the table, I'm not too worried for myself if I'm doing my 7 sets a week of hamstrings or 8 sets a week of hamstrings, which is about where I'm at right now, all in one session, because that just seems to lead to a little bit more repeatable recovery that I'm actually comfortable pushing that next session in. Again, I think we could have a whole nother discussion about whether you need to be fully recovered to benefit from another session, et cetera, et cetera. But in my case, I'm like, I don't want to do leg curls right now. My hamstrings feel like they're going to come off the bone. So just for me, from like an adherence perspective and from a long-term volume accumulation and just good quality set accumulation, I'm going to train my hamstrings with lower frequencies. But I have other muscles, like, for example, my lateral delts. I've been training them for 4 times a week for a very long time now, and I have very little trouble with that. Progression has been totally fine, and it's not hampered my adherence in terms of just accumulating quality sets on the curve. Now, again, I'm just using that to illustrate how just to put my cards on the table as a result of our results, previous results, limitations thereof, I'm not going in there and saying, what is the optimal frequency? I'm more so moving the pieces around the chessboard in order to maximize the quality sets that are occurring over a pretty long time period. And sometimes that leads to pretty low volumes because really high volumes can be unsustainable for some people. Sometimes that leads to pretty dang high volumes and relatively high frequencies, right? This variable kind of falls under the category, if you will, of like, I don't want to say secondary, but flexible and requires some strategy, if you will, or requires a little bit of troubleshooting. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I 100% agree. The way that I view frequency when training for hypertrophy essentially is just basically every single training variable comes with the presupposition or the assumption that set quality is high and you're training like with high effort, more or less. And I find from a practical perspective, frequency is the variable, and splits are kind of what I'm thinking when I'm thinking of frequency, are what you can manipulate to ensure that assumption is met, more or less. So for you, if I made you go train your hamstrings 4 times a week, I just have a hard time believing that even if the volume per session was basically the same, distributed the same weekly volume over all those sessions, like after a period of time, I have a feeling you would just hate that and your effort would be compromised, the training enjoyment, all those kind of things. And then obviously the long-term sustainability and the kind of the effort under the curve that you're applying on a very long time scale is then compromised. And any theoretical benefit of frequency, again, this is where I was talking about the cost benefit analysis, is crucial to understand the benefit so you can appropriately contextualize the cost. That very, very small theoretical benefit, if you take the slope of the dose response from the main model entirely literally, which obviously you shouldn't do, but let's say you did, that minuscule benefit is not worth completely compromising your training effort. That is going to limit the output that you're creating. That's going to drive the majority of the stimulus. So that's essentially my mindset with frequency. More or less, I essentially think all splits or training programs and distributions of volume that people kind of naturally land upon are all reasonable and are all good options because they basically are all going to train the major muscle groups directly 1 to 3 times a week, and then the fractional is kind of distribute within that range for the most part, which means they're all serviceable relative to our main model. And then from there, it's just about, okay, that's accomplishing the physiological, you're checking that box ultimately. Like you don't need to think about it really more than that, at least is what our results are basically telling you. And then from there, you're just logistically bumping things up or down to accomplish and satisfy preferences, ability to deal with the soreness and things like that that you're kind of talking about. And in my case, again, don't want to use the strength examples too much, but like that was basically the only way I could get my bench press to go up was to manipulate this to a pretty extreme degree. And
Frequency.
then strength is a different example, like you said, but it's just under that premise that like you're just trying to make frequency meet your needs more or less.
And something I keep coming back to when I think about frequency is I have a hard time suggesting a framework of thinking about a training variable that removes flexibility or removes tools in the toolbox for the lifter or for the coach if I don't have like strong evidence for it. So I could absolutely come up with theoretical rationale that even I like am really intrigued by for higher frequencies being better. And as we've mentioned multiple times, per session volumes being higher than they were in the included studies or lower than they were in the included studies. I could come up with potential scenarios where I'm like, frequency absolutely matters so long as XYZ. And again, I might even be intrigued by that. But as a scientist for sure, and even as a coach and in terms of communicating science, no matter which hat I'm using, I currently don't feel comfortable making a strong recommendation based on the data that we do have. So put more simply, frequency doesn't have a reliable, consistent, independent effect on hypertrophy. So as a scientist, as a coach, as a science communicator, I'm going to allow room for that flexibility, given we do see consistent, reliable, identifiable effects from other training variables, specifically volume and proximity to failure. That doesn't mean you need to do 100 sets a week, right? There's so many caveats to discuss there that we discussed before. For some people, that might be 5 sets a week. For some people, that might be 15, maybe 25. Who knows? So ultimately, that leads me to a recommendation that we've collaborated on that is, again, conceptual in nature. We did include a number here, which is a little bit different for us, but I think in this case, it's a little bit more called for because frequency is quite constrained in terms of just the number of options. And ultimately, what we've landed on is that when volume is accounted for, any benefit of frequency isn't clear or consistent. So when you take that into consideration, alongside the consideration that frequency is often dependent on other training variables and individual considerations, that leads us to believe that there is definitely no one-size-fits-all frequency recommendation. However, when there is no clear downside to training adherence or good quality execution of training, lifters that are looking to hedge their bets may choose to train with a frequency of at least 2 for each muscle group, because our model might have indicated a slightly beneficial effect of frequencies above 1. Again, scientist hat on. I can't say that is absolutely the case, but it leans in that direction at times. And there are some theoretical rationales why it might be beneficial. But as a coach, as a science communicator, I would also say that frequencies of 1 time per week are totally reasonable if those benefit your adherence and if those benefit your ability to accumulate good quality training and be consistent with it.